Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here with the System Simplified podcast, where we interview top entrepreneurs, founders, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And this podcast is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group. At Business Success Consulting Group, we create custom processes and tailor-made business systems so businesses can thrive and grow. And today's guest is Rob Delavan. Hi, Rob.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I am so excited about our conversation because, Rob, you're a serial entrepreneur. You are you are.
Yeah, guilty. Okay, I'm guilty. Yes.
Okay, good. All right, we established that,
Mm-hmm.
and we're gonna have our conversation about scaling and what does it really take to have a business where you work on the business instead of in the business. We're gonna talk about your journey. So, because now that you have 4 companies, right? You are the founder of 4 more. Did I miss one? Okay, so let's see.
Well, we're up to 6, but that's okay.
6. Okay, I missed
Yes.
2. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you are the founder of Delavan Realty.
Mm-hmm.
You are the founder of Delavan PDX Property Management.
Right.
PDX stands for Portland. For those of you, we're both located in Portland, Oregon. So PDX,
Right.
Portland. You have Delavan Contracting Services,
Mm-hmm.
and you have ROI Tax.
Right.
And I guess I
then,
missed 2.
yeah, there's 2 other small entities. One of them really supports the real estate side of things, which is called Admin by Design. It's basically a transaction coordination company. We work for my own company as well as a number of other brokers in the region that sell real estate. And then the last one is a little entity called ROI Marketing. And basically we do, the website and the digital marketing that goes with that for my own companies, as well as a couple of the other partners companies. And then actually we branch out to help other people out in the public. So that's
Excellent.
been kind of fun.
Yeah. So we are basically going to discuss your journey and then really dive into what does it take to actually go from one company, scaling that one to another. And I also love your concept of when you need something, some kind of a service, you go, why wouldn't I just start another company that can service my companies, but can also service others? Because that is a great concept of increasing your stream of revenue and how you get revenue, but in parallel lines to your own that can then support themselves by external clients, but then service you as an internal client, which I think is brilliant.
It's one of those things that's sometimes every once in a while I'll come up for air and say, oh, am I stretching myself too thin, right? Just with all the different companies, but really, especially and I can get into it when we talk about kind of the timeline, but my contracting services side really just grew exactly how you said, Adi. I was chasing quality. I was chasing trying to control the price, and I was trying to control the schedule. And that was selling, real estate and dealing with property management and dealing with referrals from the tax side and everything else. And people just had crummy contractors that weren't very good at business. And finally got to a point of being frustrated enough to say, okay, forget it. I'm going to do it. And we'll start with core values and we'll work our way there. And it's been very successful. So it is a lot of fun. There maybe are some limits to how many complementary things we can do, though. So anyway.
Okay, well, we'll see, because I know this is probably not the end.
No, it's certainly not. That's the problem. Once you start doing this, you're like, oh, well, I guess we could do that too. So
exactly,
it gets very interesting.
But let's start at the beginning. Let's start with your story. We all like stories,
right?
And I'm so curious about your story. So tell me, how did you get started with the first one, which will be the Delavan Realty?
Yes. So to tell that story a little bit, I have to back up about 40 years. In the early to mid 70s, my folks, they got married, I want to say 74, and they bought their first house that same year. And it was very cheap. I don't know exactly the purchase price, but what I do know is that their payment was in the $80 a month range. for a 30-year fixed mortgage. And a year or so later, they bought another one, and the payment was in the $90 a month range. And my dad worked for, he was a geologist. He worked for the Bureau of Land Management, which is federal government, Department of Interior. And he made X amount of dollars, and you worked for the government and you get a little tiny raise every single year. And that's what you did. And on the side, he always bought real estate. And my mom still tells this story that she was a bit peeved at him when they bought their third house. And the reason why she was basically had a little bit of fear there was their third house, the payment was over $100. It was about $110 a month. And for some reason in her head, she had a psychological barrier there was, oh my gosh, it's over $100. Can we afford that? What happens with the tenants in the previous houses? Well, they never sold the previous houses. They just kept buying the next and the next and the next. And fast forward through the 80s, which were crazy. They all tell all the stories about 18% interest and that sort of thing, like everybody who did real estate in the 80s. By the early to mid 90s, most of the houses that they bought in the 70s and 80s were paid for. And they started buying a few commercial buildings and just small stuff and selling off a house or two to do that. It's called a 1031 exchange. That's not what this podcast is about, but it's an excellent tool for deferring taxes. So they started doing that a little bit in the 90s. That's when I graduated from high school, late 90s, went off to college, lived in Southern California, had a great time, got a degree in finance, thought I was going to be some sort of stockbroker in New York or something. And just went to school because that's what everybody did. And graduated, spent another couple of years down there working in banking, realized that I wasn't really built to be an employee. And because I would question too many things. And then my wife ended up wanting to come to Oregon to get into nursing school. And my folks said, well, we can't pay you very much, but would you come and work for us on the real estate side? So fast forward over the next, 2000s, we sold a bunch of homes, and we would take out a little ad in the newspaper that said house for sale. Here's the price. And this was like 05, 06, 07. If you remember, that was the boom time before the bust. The last three houses to liquidate their entire residential portfolio were sold in May of 2007. Well, in August of 2007, we crashed, or started that crash of 7, 8, 9, 10. And by 10, things started, actually end of 10, things started to come back up. Well, we were trading and selling high-priced houses at the time to commercial buildings. And then we were flipping those commercial buildings. Very small stuff, nothing sexy at all about being the janitor, sweeping the floor, painting the wall, hanging the drywall, all the work, sweating, getting dirty, and putting in all of the work that it took to get financed. And I became an expert at QuickBooks. When I say expert, a DIY expert, before I started realizing, you got to use people. And then we basically, in about 2010, we ran out of projects. And because we liked everything that we owned at that point, I was making, this was only 11, 12 years ago. I was making less than $30,000 a year working for them, and bored, wanted more, and went and got licensed in real estate. And my first three transactions were in 2011. And I want to say I made, between $20,000 and $30,000 selling a few houses. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. And I ended up selling a lot of houses for friends and family and that sort of thing. You fast forward 2017, learned a lot how to get help, who to hire, who to not. There's whole stories there. Formed my own brokerage. And all during that time, I was still doing property management on the side. And so was doing the property management side in 2017, formed my own brokerage, had 2 realtors with me, and then gradually started ramping up on staff. That's when I really learned probably the first and most important lesson when it comes to scaling is I use this example of actually all of my new realtors when they start getting into the business, is once you know how to do paperwork, you should pay somebody to do the paperwork. And that a big one was bookkeeping. Huge, because bookkeeping is one of those things that you do at 10 or 11 o'clock at night as a business owner when everybody else is sleeping.
Saturday morning or Sunday morning.
Exactly. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah.
I mean, you know that intimately, right? We've all been there that as entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
So,
I don't like the late nights on bookkeeping. I prefer the early mornings. Yes.
Well, exactly. Because that's when I make the mistakes is 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I made the mistakes. And, you learn from that you got to be present to do that. It's very important. So offloaded paperwork. That was my first hints of, hey, maybe you should have a transaction coordinator. So I was hiring people outside to do transaction coordination, to sell a home. You might have 50 hours in selling a home and 25 of that is really just busy work. It's clerical work, it's admin, running errands, do different things like that versus actually negotiating the deal and being strategic. So that happened for a few years. We finally I mentioned it before, got a bit frustrated or had been frustrated for a decade or more with contractors out there and just needed to control the price, the quality and the schedule, and formed the contracting services in 2020 of all times, which is, COVID year. And that was the same time that I was working with a small group of referral partners with ROI Financial, which is not something that I own, but has ROI Financial, Lance Johnson and his team have been very valuable referral partners for me over the years. They're very pro real estate in their financial advising side. We then started talking to my CPA, her name's Sue York, and buying her tax practice. We realized very quickly that, and you'll see the same theme here, you can't do real estate without being dialed in on tax. You can, but you're playing checkers when the rest of the world, especially the Internal Revenue Service, are playing chess. Tax law is very complicated, and you need to bring in the professionals that they do that all day long. It's the same thing. If you know how to do paperwork, pay somebody to do it and they'll probably do it better. Well, if you know how to do TurboTax, you should pay somebody to do it that'll do it a lot better. And then the financial side was very instrumental in basically educating me on the need to do tax planning. And as I went through that process, what ends up happening is I realized how many of my clients were missing opportunities on that side of things. Where, hey, they own real estate, but they're not depreciating. They're not doing a number of different things that could potentially make them a real estate professional, even though they invest heavily in real estate. Property management, contracting, all of the different things. It just became very apparent that we needed to be doing that. So we went, we bought into a tax firm, and now we're in the process of scaling up in different areas. We're talking about Bend. We're talking about Vancouver, the east side of Portland. Right now we're Lake Oswego and in Beaverton, and really looking at acquisitions from a strategic standpoint. It's very difficult to get tax professionals straight out of school. There's not very many of them, frankly. And as an aside, if I could give some advice, if anybody wanted to do really, really well in business, get a tax degree, get your CPA, and you will forever be employed. The issue becomes you'll be employed with opportunity to buy in just about any tax firm that you work for. So that brings us to today, where there's more and more opportunity to do more businesses at the same time. The scaling has just been really apparent. For if you see a need, there's opportunity to just okay, we're already making the sales and we're sending it elsewhere. And sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. What if we could control that and make that person a raving fan of all of the businesses that are synergistic? So that's really where we're at today. And at that point, it's the right systems and the right people. And that's
absolutely. And we're going to talk about that. I just wanted you to let you tell the entire story, because I feel it's fascinating, right? But as you're telling it, Rob, it really sounds like, oh, okay, well, I've done that, and then I've done that, and then I decided to buy more businesses, etc. Mm-hmm. But we know that there were ups and downs. We know that it's not that easy, right? And there were roadblocks and obstacles. I'm really interested of what was your pivoting point? Like at one point you decided, okay, enough. being an employee, even if you're working for your own parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
At one point was enough of making $20,000, $30,000 a year
Mm-hmm.
to actually, hey, I need to do something about my life, right?
Yes.
And deciding, okay, you're going to be an entrepreneur or you're going to buy several businesses. Was that just happening like gradually, or was there a pivoting moment where you said you changed your mind and something shifted?
Right. That's an excellent question. There are definitely life events that influence that. For example, getting married, finishing college was a big one. Then getting married within a couple years of that, relocating to a different area, looking what was out there. And then, having buying the first home myself, not necessarily being able to qualify for the home that I wanted to. And then, first children, and, I have two now. So those things are a big driver. I'd actually like to think that it's a little bit deeper than that. And the depth of that is, I mentioned earlier, I was never a great employee, not because I didn't work hard or produce. I always worked really hard and produced. I was in banking for a couple of years out of college. Always strive to be the top. I'm competitive. I work hard. I show up. I try to as much as possible to do what I say I will do. And when I fall short, I address it and, try to hit it the next time. And that's a natural thing. The concept though is it's very easy looking backwards to see that there was certain roles, for example, working with my folks and making less than $30,000 a year for, it was like 4 or 5 years. And realizing that I wasn't satisfied, I wasn't happy doing that job because I was creating upside for someone, in this case, my parents, and I want them to do very well. I still want them to do very well. And frankly, they're a client of mine, one of many. And frankly, they're in some senses kind of a small client now. But back then, they were my only client, if you will, in that they just employed me. And I wasn't happy every day getting up and wanting to go work. Even though I did it, I was certainly not satisfied. I did not enjoy the work, even though now, there's nothing better than going out and doing a little project just for fun when I actually have the time. The issue becomes when I had to do it for someone else that was not, that did not provide any real upside that I had a piece of. That was very, very difficult to deal with. And it took a few years of a lot of, I was in my mid to late 20s and a man, and men mature slower than the ladies. And it took a number of years for me to actually mature enough to self-reflect, like, hey, is this something that I'm actually, is uncomfortable enough to change? And that's where I was probably around 2010. And hey, building some great wealth for my family and for my folks, but not really much for myself. So I fast forward to today, and almost every single entity that we have, we all do some sort of incentivization and profit share of some kind, so that there's an upside, at least for the person that's pounding the nail. And
Right.
that's a big deal. People are just as important as the systems and the right people. And you also have to accept the concept that people are going to grow, come in, they're going to do a job for a period of time, and it's okay if they transition elsewhere. In the meantime, you want to try to develop them as much as possible. And, I always have this conversation, usually the first few months to a year, when somebody's working in my organization, and it's like, oh, well, we hired you at X hourly rate plus some benefits and so forth. And they'll say, well, how do I get that $2, $3 an hour raise? And my response is always the same. And it's that $2 or $3 an hour raise is not going to move the needle for you. I promise. Now, a $10,000 or $20,000 a year raise, which would be, $5 or $10 an hour, that'll move the needle for you for a little bit. The only way you get those kind of raises, even in an environment of, 7 to 10% inflation, which we're in somewhat right now, the only way to get that kind of raise is to either move jobs, different organizations, or move jobs within your organization, within the organization you're already in there. So go for that promotion. Well, the way to do that is it's very simple. How do I add more value to the business? Right. Most engaged managers will say, wow, my worker over here, whatever position they're in, came to me and said, I want to make X. This is what I'm making now. How do I provide 5 or 10 times that value in my role or the next role to do that? And what middle management or higher is ever going to turn that down, typically, if they're leading with what can I take on from a responsibility standpoint and what can I produce to make it a no-brainer, rather than just give me a raise. I need $2 an hour. That's sort of
absolutely thing. And I think you just brought up a great point in terms of how do you scale? You hire the right people, and the right people have that right mentality of,
right.
They're not entitled. It's not like, okay, I'm exchanging my time for the money, because then it becomes, okay, I have to go to work, I have to do this, I have to do that, as opposed to how can I create on my position?
Right.
How can I take more responsibility? How can I contribute? And then when you have that mentality as the owner, then there is this reciprocity of like, hey, Rob, I'll just do whatever it takes, right? That attitude of whatever it takes, and make sure that this job is, I can take more responsibility, do more. And then, of course, there is the exchange back. So I think that is a great advice in terms of scaling by hiring the right people and compensating them correctly, right?
Right.
So now yeah, for sure. So that's the people aspect of it, having the right people with that mindset. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that processes help to scale. And you know that I'm all about processes. So share with me, how do you use processes in your business in order to scale?
So your whole world revolves around that. And interestingly enough, I found that mine does too. The only way that I've been able to do it very, very simply, though, is if you take those people we were just talking about, right? Get those right people that want to go next level, want to, scale up or level up themselves. Well, the way to do that is every single person in your business has a role. And if every single person in your business does one thing every single week, that improves the actual process, the system, the efficiency. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can measure that, but the end throughput of whatever it is that you're selling, right? There's input, throughput, and output. And output really at the end of the day is profit. And if you're fixing or upgrading one thing every week times every single person that has a job, then, and let's say you take 2 weeks off for the holidays, you now just improved 2%, 50 things. So I just converted over to 100%. Every week you're doing a 2% improvement. And it's amazing how much that actually works towards bottom line. What you're doing is you're pushing, you're stretching what you can do with the same amount of resources. So you're being more efficient on cost. And generally speaking, you're improving your sales, your marketing, all of that sort of thing. And if you can hit it from both directions and do one thing every single week, and we just prioritize that, now it requires one-to-ones with my different leaders. And then each one of my leaders has a team under them, and they're going to do a one-to-one every week with their direct reports. And if everyone from top to bottom is doing that, it's magical how you look back, oh man, 30 weeks ago, we were talking about this, and that was a level 3. And now we're like, we're at a level 8. And then what happens is then you just revisit it. Now the 8 is the 1 the next year, and you repeat. And it's that whole, big rocks, squish them to little rocks and then push them down a level. And now when you push them down, the person that just got it, it's a big rock, then they push it and so forth. And it creates.
You're really talking about continual improvement. I mean, that's
exactly.
What it is. It's a continuous improvement.
Exactly.
But as you were talking, I was thinking, you can improve for sure because that's the continuous improvement. But even if you do not necessarily, I mean, the improvement does not necessarily mean that you have to find new ways of doing it, because the way that you are doing it might be perfect, but it's a matter of bringing it so the process is super smooth, followed completely. And then you bring up that quality, right? So instead of just talking about, okay, I have a process that's in the property management area. So you have that process, but how do I refine it so I can apply it 100% correct every single time, and then take the level of service to 110, because we are covering that process. So it's not necessarily change the process, but it is perfecting the process, right?
Yes, it's small course corrections. And then, and actually a lot of this that I worked on came from a number of years ago. I read a book called The Goal. And the author's Eliyahu Goldratt, he's since passed away. He wrote this in the 80s. And you're absolutely right. You can have almost a perfect process, and it's one of how many processes that get you from the very beginning, the input, the throughput of all of these different processes, then to the output, which on the other end, really at the end of the day is profit that it's creating. Well, you could have a perfect process, say there's 10, and you have 1, 5, 6, 9, and 10 are excellent. Yet some of the others aren't. And then as you have the marching process all the way through, well, you're really in your throughput from start to finish. If it's continuously running, you're only as good as your slowest. And then the really good ones build up, in essence, inventory that piles up right in front of the slowest or the worst, if you will, depending on how you define it, what it is. And, oh, great. Well, we have a warehouse over here, if you're making widgets. And we have, between 6 and 7, we have a big pileup, but 6 is really efficient because we filled up the warehouse full of widgets that need to go from 6 to 7. Well, the whole point is not to make a widget that's good for 6 to 7. It's to make that perfect widget that's done at the end. Right. So, that's where you really start getting into how do you define efficiency and so forth. And that's been a lot of fun, especially because we're, a lot of what we do is it's really more of a service industry. We're not necessarily manufacturing a product. With taxes, we are to a degree. But it really is, at the end of the day, it's a service. Right. And you can still, it really isn't that much different than creating, building a car that has, 1,000 steps, whatever it is. You have to be really, really good from start to finish. And it's not just, these different areas, people can get tribal because, I'm responsible for this or that. Well, it's really how the entire piece fits, the entire process fits together. The perfect client is one that comes in because very few other tax firms are actually accepting tax clients. So then you end up like, okay, that's shooting fish in a barrel. We almost don't even have to have a sales funnel coming in on the tax side because their previous person just didn't have enough bandwidth to do tax planning. Well, they start doing tax planning. And then from there, you have these different properties that aren't performing for you, but have great, they don't have good revenue, but they have huge equity. So I'm going to introduce you over to the real estate side. Well, the real estate side, we look at it, and in a tax advantaged way, we're going to get them into something that fits their life better and produces more income, which then potentially we could manage their property for them after that. And then in that process, there's going to be contracting. In that process, there was a transaction that needed to be managed on the real estate. So that happened. And throughout the whole process, the financial advisor is going to be working with them as the liaison between the tax and everybody else as a seat on the table. I mean, it can get very complicated. But what's happening is this person, this individual, their production of their life, their estate, their wealth is being affected from start to finish with all of these different companies that are synergistic and really pushing them forward. So that's where it's, okay, our real estate side is relatively small, and it started that we were working these other companies, but we can be 2 to 5 to 10x on, and we are on a couple of the entities. They've way outproduced just the small real estate brokers that we are with 10 brokers.
Right.
Because why would I do that? That's super competitive. Let's do a really good job there. And frankly, contracting, the sales, if you just show up and do a really good job, you almost never have to sell. Same thing, tax people, they trust their CPAs. And if they do a good job and they're winning at life, oh, it's incredible. So that's that piece of, there's not one way to address the efficiency or the process improvement, but your systems have to be dialed. So hopefully I didn't meander too much on that.
No,
as you can tell,
brilliant.
I get passionate. So
you do, and I can feel it. But here's the brilliance of what I heard: is the common denominator is excellence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because throughout your story, so you had this, you graduated college, you start working for your parents. It wasn't enough because there was no excellence, right? I mean, you felt like there was no excellence. You can do more. So you were pursuing that excellence in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Then the way that you are describing how you scaled is like, okay, excellence, you're looking for excellence in your people, right? So they're not just there for the paycheck, but they really want to contribute, and that's how they can make their life excellent.
Right.
Then you use processes in order to give an excellent service. Because as you were telling your story, the word that you keep using, or the concept you kept saying, is that if you do a good job, if you give a really good service, if you create a really good product, then people want to work with you. So that's again excellence throughout processes. And that is when you were describing how you use processes, it's really to continuously improving so you can produce that excellent experience. And I think that is really the common thread throughout the story on how you came to be who you are today and have what you have, is because you follow that thread of excellence, but not to the, some people want to like, okay, we're going to do it like in such high quality, or it's going to be super excellent and I don't care about the profit. It's still being profitable, but that's what drives the profit, is creating that excellent experience. Right.
And one of the pieces and I would speak to that, is this concept of with scaling, right? Because that is, you're an expert in that, is scale a business, right? How do you go from here to here to here? And what I've found, and this is just the experience of it, is the stickiest businesses are, and when I say sticky, is the ones that demand the most time from an owner. And that's kind of, let's call myself the serial entrepreneur. The ones that take the most time right now is still actually the Realty, residential commercial brokerage, because I have all of these clients for all of these decades, that they expected from way back, Rob, right? And versus I have brokers that are way better than I ever was, because they can focus on less things. As a business owner, you have 27 different jobs, right? They focus on individual jobs and they're really, really good at it. So what ends up happening is I've spent more time systematizing the real estate side so that it could extricate myself from the day-to-day production, versus, for example, the tax side. I'm in basically the board meetings, every other week for a couple hours, and then do a few other high level working with the management for a couple hours. And it's the same thing on contracting, same thing on property management, same thing on the other entities, is I'm spending very little of my time, probably 3 to 5 hours a week on each of those. And what happens is it's those systems that provide the freedom to do that. And then you plug the people in. So that's what it is. And it's as simple as having standard operating procedures for everything. Have it written out, have a handbook, have a flow chart, have when people have to interact with each other, sometimes they get a bit complicated, but you have to map it out. So you figure out where they're complicated and where the bottlenecks are and so forth. And if you do all of these different things, then that's what creates that freedom for that entrepreneur, which is really what I've been striving for all these, really for the last 20 years and that's what I really found, going back to the previous part of the story. I love to work, love working, But the part of working that I love is actually working with creatively. I'm not an artist in that sense, but I am an artist in the sense that I love creating businesses and opportunity for people. And frankly, if I do that, I don't really have to worry about my bank account. Like, it grows, it's profitable, right? So that's the fun part, is I've basically tried to fire myself from as many jobs as I possibly can and actually work on the businesses instead of in it. And they're less sticky that way. And that's the piece where, there's probably at some point a certain limit, but as these businesses keep scaling, they don't really care that I'm the stockholder, because there becomes an inertia in and of themselves. And they self-manage to a certain degree, and they really just report to me about success, failures, and they've already figured out the course corrections. And that gets to be a lot of fun. And frankly, 10 years ago, I didn't even have a concept of this. I just wasn't there yet. So it's a blast.
It's a great story, Rob, and very inspiring. And you said it so well, especially when you were talking at the end in terms of like having those systems in place so you can actually have the freedom that you like and you want.
Huge. You will never have your time back if you don't have systems in place so that when there's questions, instead of going to you as the owner, they can actually go back to, and we all kind of roll our eyes. Oh, I got to go. What does the handbook say? What is our standard operating procedure? How did we deal with this the 100 times before that led to that standard operating procedure? And you have to trust it and realize that for the most part, none of these situations are unique. Every once in a while, you get a huge outlier, but even then, most of it's the same. So you're not going to create freedom unless you have that. And that's huge. And that's your world. That's where I learned so much from you. I don't consider myself, brilliant in that way, other than I'm a pretty good learner, and I don't mind asking a question. And it's okay if I look stupid. I don't know very many things. I'm not, if I want to find out something, I got to ask the questions until I get it. And it's going to take what it's going to take to get there.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, Rob, it's been awesome to have you on this podcast. So if our listeners want to find out, to get in touch with you, talk to you, use one of your companies, how do they get a hold of you?
Well, there's a number of websites that I could give. I don't want to give you 6. So I'll just give you our real estate website, www.delavan-realty.com. And that's DELAVAN-realty, REALTY.com. And you can start there. We have contact information, emails, and all of that sort of thing is in there. At the end of the day, you'll get me in to a degree, and frankly, we can usually solve the problem. So it's excellent. That's the fun part.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Rob. It's been a pleasure having you here as a guest. Thank you for all the knowledge and the wisdom that you shared.
Thank you so much, Adi. It's always a pleasure. Every time I get to talk to you, I learn something every time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.